everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please give us just a few minutes before we wait for others to join in.
Ilse, you might need to be a little bit louder.
Sounds good.
And there you are at the top. Hello, everybody. Oh, they're muted.
Just a few more moments. Wow, so many people. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning, and a few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question, and we'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Gilman, who will be presenting on The Striking Man in a Complex Icon, Basil the Great's Fascinating Life. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Dr. Gilman.
Oh, thank you, Ilse. Good morning, everybody, wherever you are, and whatever time it is for you. For some, I know it's already afternoon, and I know a few people who got up really early to see this where they are. The icon that we are looking at on this first slide is an icon that strikes you when you walk into the Timken Museum's collection of icons for both its color and its complexity. It takes a while to figure out what's going on here, but the complexity and color make it a very riveting presentation. That's certainly been my experience, and I know that this man, Basil himself, was complex and riveting. So I would like to tell you his story and tell you about the times he lived in to some extent to give background to this phenomenal picture or icon. Let's see now if I can. It's not advancing for me here. Not sure why.
Lauren, you might have to go out,
Okay.
unshare, and go in again. That might fix it.
Okay, I think we just got it. So this is called a vita icon, the Latin word vita for life. So this kind of an icon tells a life story, obviously in a selected few vignettes. It's a picture cycle. And this icon has been in the Timken collection, the Putnam Foundation's collection, since 1980, when it was bought from the collection of a man named George Hahn. I recommend, especially for those who work with the icon collection at the Timken or are especially interested in it, to read something about Russian icons purchased by Americans in the article at the bottom right corner here. You will be able to go back to this. You don't have to copy the reference down right now. You will be able to go back to this because this presentation will be recorded on the Timken's Facebook page. So you can go back to this and
Dr. Gilman, I think you're muted.
okay. Have I been muted the whole time?
No, it was just for a few seconds.
Oh, okay. So anyway, in the lower right, I recommend this article, especially if you're interested in Russian icons in general and American collections and in especially the Timkens. So proceeding now. First, I'm going to tell you who we're not talking about, because I'm very aware that many people who are interested in art are also travelers. And like me, maybe you've been in Moscow and seen the incredible St. Basil's Cathedral. But I want to make sure you know that the St. Basil we're talking about is another person. So as wonderful as this place is, and as wonderful as it would be to talk about this St. Basil, this is not who we're talking about today. The person we're talking about is a man who is from ancient Caesarea in what is today Turkey, from a section of that country called Cappadocia. Now, if you also have traveled to Turkey, chances are you've been here too. And I will tell you more about that as we go along. Here you see the dates for Basil's life. So he is a man of the 4th century AD in an area of the Roman Empire, which was on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. The name of his town, Caesarea, may also ring a bell with some of you, but we need to be careful about which Caesarea we're talking about. A lot of travelers who go to the Eastern Mediterranean end up going to Caesarea in what is today Israel. And that's maybe the more famous Caesarea. But there were numerous ancient Caesareas honoring the Caesars, and Basil is from one of those. His Caesarea is in Cappadocia, ancient Mazacah. And if you have been in Turkey, you very likely have been there in Kayseri today. It is a large city with many different interesting tourist attractions. So if you have been in Turkey, you've likely been here. Basil comes from an upper class, Greek-speaking, Romanized family. That meant he had many advantages given to him because of the wealth of his family and the phenomenal education that he received. But also his family was Christian and had been Christian for quite a while. His father's parents, Macrina the elder and her husband, were Christians. And earlier in their lives, they had had to hide in the forests during the persecution under the Emperor Diocletian. His mother, Amelia, was the daughter of a martyr. And his father, who was also named Basil, for whom he was named, was a lawyer and a rhetorician. Sorry, my voice is clouding up here. Excuse me. So the point is, Basil comes from not only wealth, but he comes from a long-standing Christian family. So he was not a new convert, although he was not baptized until he was an adult, which was customary at the time. And he comes from a family who had undergone persecution. So they did not live their Christianity lightly. The grandparents had been in great danger, and Amelia's parents, one of the parents had been a martyr. So we keep this in mind as we now look a little bit more at Basil's life. I wanted to put a map in here to kind of locate the places that we'll be talking about and have already talked about. So here you see the eastern area of the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. Cappadocia is here if you follow my cursor. And you see Caesarea of Cappadocia here. So this is where he's born, and this is where he will also eventually become a church leader, and he will also die here. But he will have traveled extraordinarily within this eastern area of the Roman Empire, including down to Egypt. So this is kind of our stage, you could say, this whole circle that I'm creating with my cursor. This is kind of our stage for the events of his life. A person who really influenced his family was this man known as Saint Gregory the Miracle Worker, Gregory Thaumaturgus. And Gregory was a person who affected many Christians in the region of Cappadocia and had a great influence on Basil's parents. He had instructed Basil's paternal grandmother, Macrina the Elder. Macrina the Elder has a lot of fame in her own right, and she is the one for whom Basil's sister Macrina was also named. So we have Macrina the Elder and Macrina the Younger in the history of this family. And while we can't really talk too much about them today, they are very famous in the history of Christians in this period, the Macrinas. Anyway, Gregory Thaumaturgus had incredible influence on the family, and he's a very famous person. Here you see him on the pages of a Menologion. A Menologion is a Byzantine book telling stories of saints. And we get a lot of good representations of people, ancient people, in these Menologia. These people had been affected particularly by the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. So I put his dates here as a rule, as when he ruled, 284 to 305. The thing about him is he began what became the last persecution of Christians in the empire. So the persecutions had always been sporadic. They were never everywhere all at once. But this persecution it was the empire's worst, but became the last. The reason it became the last is Christianity by that point had spread so much. People knew that Christians were not as dangerous as they had been made out to be, nor were they considered as bad citizens as they had been made out to be, and so on. So his persecution really failed because there was already a general sympathy for Christians, like, leave them alone, let them live. But it was one last convulsion, you could say. And it failed miserably. And out of this then came some rather amazing developments that were actually, in retrospect, not that great for Christianity. Because along comes the very famous Emperor Constantine, who in his period, under his rule, basically allows Christianity not only to be left alone, not be persecuted, but become one of the legal religions. The impact of Constantine on world history is absolutely extraordinary. We're going to talk about just that slice of it that affected Christians. And unfortunately, leave out so much else that could be said about him. You see here the dates of his rule, 306 to 337. So Basil's life is heavily influenced by the period of Constantine, toward the end of which Basil was born. We talk about this period in ancient history or in Byzantine history, and particularly as the Constantinian turning point with respect to Christianity. What does that mean? Constantine and the Western emperor at the time, because the empire was already divided into East and West, at least in terms of administration. Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan in 313, which tolerated Christianity and other religions. So it was no longer illegal to be Christian. One result of that was that Constantine, whether he was seriously a believer or not, or whether he was ostensibly a believer in order to unify the empire, in any case, he came to be seen as the great patron of the church. From then on, churches could be built. Before that, Christians, like other groups, had pretty much hidden out in people's houses. They had renovated houses to make those into churches. But now, under Constantine, huge churches could be built. Small ones too, but also huge ones. He himself ordered the creation of numerous basilicas, some of which we still have. The Basilica in Nazareth, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the original St. Peter's in Rome. He ordered these built, and we now have, you could say, those basilicas still exist either under the current ones or as part of the current ones. Was this good? Well, the hierarchy of Christianity began to more and more model itself on the Roman hierarchy, so that bishops, archbishops came to be seen as important figures in a hierarchy. Whereas before, if you were a bishop, when Christians were being persecuted, you would have to be one of the most courageous of leaders. Chances are, in many ways, you would have to be very surreptitious in the work you did. You would have to hide out at times and so on. Now, bishops became a parallel hierarchy to the Roman hierarchy. So becoming a bishop was a good thing to become if you were, let's say you're a young man and you're looking for a career that will be interesting, but also pay you well and allow you to be a leader and so on. So to become a bishop after Constantine was not necessarily to be a religious person. It was to get a very good position. So some people tried to become bishops who weren't even Christian believers. And this was actually very tragic for Christianity because it led to a certain amount of corruption and also increased the pomp in Christianity. When you have big churches with lots of aisles, you have literally the space for parades. And so there were Christian leaders, bishops and priests and so on, who modeled their entrance into these big churches on the entrance that imperial official or an emperor would make into a secular basilica. Basil resisted, of course, much of this, and much of the reason he was able to resist it was that he had an extraordinary education. So I want to go back to his own life and tell you about his education. It was a combination of humanism, philosophy, and profound faith. So in his context, he first studies under his father, who was himself a famous rhetorician, studied in his own home in Caesarea, and then as a next step went to what was then called Constantinople, today Istanbul, to study under the famous orators and various philosophers there. The Emperor Constantine had started extending the capital on Constantinople in extraordinary ways. It was a time of building boom and development of Christianity in Constantinople. It was a very exciting period. As I already said, it had some downsides as far as Christianity went, but it was where you would go from Basil's town, Caesarea. It was where you would go if you wanted a really good education. It was really the next step in a fine education. From there, he took the next very wonderful step of going to Athens. Athens had still been the center of classical enlightenment. This is where you went to study with the best philosophers of the time, especially Platonic philosophy, but other subjects also. So Basil widely studied. He was there for 5 years, and there he became close friends with a man from his own town who was also there, Gregory Nazianzus. Gregory becomes his lifelong friend. Gregory himself said, "We were two minds in one soul." So that's how Gregory himself explained their friendship. As I go forward here, you will see that Basil and Gregory, along with Basil's brother, also named Gregory, become extraordinary leaders in Christian thought. So Basil decided to be baptized in 356 when he traveled to Jerusalem. You might think that's strange because he comes from a long-standing Christian family. They had been martyrs and so on, some of them. And yet he's not baptized until he is an adult. That was similar with Constantine, who was not baptized. Constantine wasn't even baptized till he was dying. So the practice of what today we call adult baptism was quite normal to them. Once he was baptized, he decided to live a very ascetic life when he returned to Caesarea. So he began, by the way, baptism has not changed his status. He's a layman. He's not a priest. He's not a monk. He's a layman who has decided to live a very ascetic life. And he does this back in Caesarea. And then he decides to learn more about asceticism by going to Egypt, especially Egypt, but he goes down through Syria and Palestine, and he wants to check out other monks who are living, other ascetics. He especially goes to Egypt, which we'll talk about in a minute. After he returns from this great journey of meeting these the hermits, most of them, the term for these we use is anchorites also. After he gets back, he decides to set up his own kind of monastery. And he actually has some critiques of all these hermits that he's met. And he starts his own monastery, which is called a Cenobitic or Cenobitic form of monasticism, meaning this is more of a community style. These people are not hermits, although they might have hermetic periods, but they combine living together with some solitude. So Gregory joins him, and that's an important part of the life story of both of them, because they are basically inseparable people. Looking again at the map, you can see how relatively easy it was to go from his home city of Caesarea here, right down through into Syria, down the coastal road into Judea, and continuing the coastal road right down into Egypt. Travel was relatively easy. It took a while. You might have to walk a lot if you couldn't get your ride. Some places here along the coast, he would be able to get ships going south. And so travel was relatively easy in this period. And that's important because it allowed him to have a wide range of experiences. This is what Egypt looked like in his period from the perspective of Roman organization into dioceses. So the term diocese, which you usually only hear today in terms of church boundaries, was a Roman term. So this is the Diocese of Egypt. And where he went would have been, where he went to meet monks, hermits, would have been over here to the west of Alexandria, especially. And then down here in the, what's called the Thebais, in these mountains along the Red Sea coast. Monasticism had developed here in many ways because of a reaction against the Constantinian turning point. Monks were reacting to actually what the faith of the martyrs had been like, which under Constantine seemed to have waned. Under Constantine, Christianity was filled with people who weren't really committed, who weren't really, many of whom weren't really believers. It was the social thing to do. It was the thing to do to be socially mobile, to move up in society, to move up into the Constantinian circles and so on. So some people reacted by saying, no, I want to be a real believer. And some went so far as to say, well, Jesus said to give everything to the poor and come follow him. So I'm going to do that. So some people literally gave away their wealth, gave away their possessions, and became monks, hermits. Don't get confused. These people aren't priests. They're individual laymen who make this radical move. So they wanted to protest in many ways society. So there's a very interesting statement by a famous scholar of spirituality who says it's not by chance that anchoritism, meaning hermits, the retreat to the desert, spread so suddenly just as the state made its peace with the church. So Basil's interested in these people and he goes to see them. Now, previously I did a talk about the most famous of these, St. Anthony. It's on Timken's Facebook website if you want to go back and learn more about this period. And it's very interesting. And once the Timkens open again, you can see this incredibly interesting painting about this, one of these hermits, St. Anthony, the most famous of all of them. And in that talk, I showed you where typically these are the mountains along the Red Sea. Anthony's cave was up in these mountains. And this is the monastery that eventually resulted, that's still there that you can visit. So Basil's going to places like this, meeting these people, talking to them, trying to learn how to be more ascetic, because it's not simple. It's not simple to be a hermit. You have to think of what you have to do. You have to spend a lot of time getting food, fixing your own food. You have to find ways to be safe from weather and from dangerous people. It is difficult to stay warm and so on. Where are you going to get some kind of clothes? And hermits tend to be wanderers and shoes tend to wear out. So do they have to make their own? How do they survive? It's not easy to be a hermit, which is also why lots of hermits then decided eventually, well, maybe we should band together and at least do some things in common. All right, anyway, Basil's very influenced by these people, but he has some critiques that I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, back to the icon so that we can see how the parts of his life that I've told you about so far are represented in the icon. As a Vita icon, you would think it would have a chronology to it. And it does the way we read it today, at least based on the scholarship of art historians. It isn't clear that the author or what we would call the writer of an icon, the artist of an icon. And by the way, some of them were done by multiple artists together. It isn't clear that they necessarily were concerned with chronology, but we tend to be because we like to get things systematized. So for us, we're going to read this from left to right, and we're going to keep going left to right instead of going around it in some kind of counterclockwise or clockwise circle. So we're going to start here with the birth of Basil, and you see his mother Amelia here in the bed, and you see nurses down here with the new child. The artist has made it clear that they live in a very substantial building. You see the columns and so on, reflecting that the family is well off. The second little vignette here shows Basil as a student, probably indicating the period when he's studying with his father right there in Caesarea. The third vignette then is his baptism, which took place in Jerusalem. It was supposedly near a cave, and at the time there was a dove above him, reminiscent of the scene in the Gospels where Jesus is baptized and a dove appears over his head. So we haven't talked yet about his ordination, but that's what you see here in the fourth vignette. So once he goes back to Caesarea and starts his own monastery, after he'd been in Egypt visiting hermits, he is ordained by the local bishop Eusebius. Okay, when he got back from Egypt and he began his own monastery, and some people wanted to join him, he came up with a combination idea. Well, I don't think the life of hermits is the best way to live out being a Christian. Because he thought, how can you love other people when you're not in contact with other people, and so on? How can you serve the poor when you're in a cave in the mountains in Egypt? These were his kind of interesting critiques. But he did recommend that if someone wanted to be seriously Christian, join his monastery perhaps, that they should spend some time as a hermit. So he recommended that people go to one of the caves in Cappadocia, in this area called Gorem, and spend some time there as a hermit. Now again, because I'm guessing that some of you are travelers, I bet you've been here. I've been here, and it was simply an extraordinary place to see. It's full of caves, as you can see, because of the way the rock was formed under volcanic conditions and so on, and it was very soft in places. And so the erosion has resulted in these kind of fairy castle type structures, which people could easily carve out. So the caves weren't all there. Some of them were, but a lot of them have been carved out over the centuries. So you can see this is a great place for hermits. Ready-made. You can also see the effect of humans, which have kind of squared the windows or the entries to these caves and so on. Some people still live in some of these. And while I only put a couple pictures here to remind you of what I'm guessing many of you have already seen, you can see what it would be like to be Basil's kind of hermit. You could be alone a lot in these caves. But you could come out and maybe people would bring some food to you, or maybe if you're really sick, somebody else would help you and so on. Here's another shot of the landscape, and you can see that people live above this right up here today. It's a World Heritage Site today, of course, and there are many caves with Christian and other frescoes in them that art historians are very interested in. And yeah, here's the last shot I put in, but you can see in the distance, farming and so on is going on. So Basil thought it would be good for people to live here for a while as hermits, but then come to join his monastery. And his sister, Macrina, his younger sister, she had already started with her mother and a few servants. They had already started their own kind of monastic living in one of their larger homes. And so Basil's monastery was not very far from them. And he began to found other monasteries. So he became like in retrospect, he's like the father of Byzantine monasticism. Well, Gregory Nazianzus joins him, and between the two of them, they start writing. And the most famous Christian philosopher up to that time was a man named Origen, who had written in Alexandria in Egypt. And they had his writings, and they decided to do like a digest. So they took all these paragraphs that they thought were really significant that he'd written, and then they put them into it was like what we would call cut and paste. They put them into a compilation of his important writings. I'm not going to say a huge amount about Gregory Nazianzus, but he is extraordinarily important, and you could talk about him for a long time. You see that this icon is by the famous Andrei Rublev, and it's in the Dormition Cathedral of Vladimir, Russia. Now, as I said, Basil had a critique of hermits, and he himself was very concerned with the poor. And he started outside ancient Caesarea, a place where poor people could live, sick people could come. He collected friends who were doctors, others who were willing to help with the poor and the sick, and he effectively created a hospital. In the history of hospitals, this is considered one of the first. It's named after him, a Basiliad. I put a reference here that you might enjoy reading. You can come back again on Facebook and click on this. It should be hyper. There's a doctor in Boston who wrote about this in the context of the history of hospitals. So hospitals didn't really exist. There were military hospitals for the Roman army in the sense of taking care of wounded and sick soldiers. And there were places called Asclepions. So the god Asclepius was the god of healing. And here and there were temples to Asclepius that you could go to and pray to the god to heal you. But real places of treatment for sick were still a new idea. So in the history of medicine, Basil's Basiliad was very significant. And this took his energy and the energy of Gregory and other people, their families and other people in the monasteries, took a great deal of their energy and dedication. At a certain point, Basil was basically forced to become a bishop. He didn't really want to be, but his intelligence, his administrative skills, and so on were needed. And so a man named Eusebius, who was already a bishop of a larger region, ordained him a bishop. I put some dates here, just in case they matter. But by 370, then he becomes the bishop of Caesarea. So he's the real leader of the area. But this brings him then into some of the great debates of the day. And going back now to the icon, so we are now on the second level here. So we've seen the top level, it's off the screen, and now we go left and then right, and then left and then right, and so on. So on the left, you see him being ordained a bishop. And you notice that this is when he begins to have this very colored, cross-covered cross with many crosses. It's called a phelonion. It's also called a polystarion because it's got many crosses. So when you see that kind of a robe on a Byzantine figure, it means that that person's a bishop. So here he's being ordained a bishop. And on the right, as a bishop, then Jesus and the apostles were said to appear to him and the deacon that's right behind his head. So they tell Basil how to conduct the Eucharistic liturgy. Now, there was a man named Ephraim, he later known as Saint Ephraim, going back to the left. He's in the next vignette. And he has heard about Basil and Basil's effectiveness, Basil's monastery, Basil's basilia, Basil as a bishop. And he's very, very impressed, but he's also thinking, oh, he's a bishop. He must be rich, and I wonder how religious he really is. So Ephraim comes to visit him on the left in that vignette. And when he encounters Basil, what he sees is a pillar of fire, which in biblical terms is a manifestation of the holy, which is pretty scary if you're confronted with a pillar of fire. So he comes to realize that this is Basil. He has a great deal of interaction with Basil, and then he asks Basil, could you please pray that I could understand Greek? He could not learn Greek. And Basil prayed for him. And over here on the right, you see over here where he has been speaking Greek. And also he comes to Basil, but notice how he's back here. He's coming to see Basil very humbly because he's had the overwhelming sense that Basil is a good man, that Basil is holy. So the point is, Ephraim's story basically teaches that you could be holy and good in any position in life. You don't have to be a hermit, or you don't have to be a monk, or whoever you are, whatever your station in life is, you could be a good person. And that's important in the context because as I've told you, some bishops have bought their position and are corrupt and so on. Okay, I want to remind you that you can be asking me questions in the chat if you have any, okay? Let's continue on now. And I'm not advancing here. But whoops, getting technical help here. Okay, so there's another Gregory, and that's Basil's brother. And he is a married man who was also a priest. He's a very quiet person. He's brilliant. His writings are among the most brilliant of the three: Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. He's absolutely brilliant. He really did not want to be a bishop, but Basil more or less forced him to become a bishop, who functioned extremely well, but it was against his, you could say, against his quiet nature, maybe. So the three of them then become known as the Cappadocians. And the three of them get deeply involved in theological issues of the 300s. So Basil, Gregory, and Gregory, sometimes shortened to Basil, Nyssa, and Nazianzus, are the Cappadocian fathers. And they have an impact even in theology today. Now, I don't want to burden you with a lot of theology. I just want to tell you a couple things so you can understand the rest of the icon and what their period was like. And they do have an impact on us today. So their period was a period of enormous questions about the identity of Jesus. We call them Christological questions. You know, when something great happens in the world afterwards, people look back at it and say, wait a minute, what made that happen? What was that all about? It was kind of like that with the person of Jesus. Jesus had an impact. Many people came to be his followers, but then they started looking back and they started to say, hey, wait, was he really human? Or was he God pretending to be human? Or was he just a human that God kind of deputized? What was he all about? And these are Christological questions. And while experience of religious believers today might not be to be debating these questions every Sunday or something, in Basil's period, they did. Okay, these are questions that literally the man and the lady on the street were debating because they didn't have final answers and it seemed to really matter. So there are many Christological heresies. You could lose your mind trying to keep them straight. Most of us who even study them to some degree need charts. Keep the charts in front of us, trying to get hold of what exactly the questions and the proposed solutions were. In any case, in the period of Basil and the two Gregories, okay, the big issue was, did God the Father at some point create God the Son, Jesus? Not an easy question to deal with, and it required then, as if you ask it now, philosophy. You need philosophy to explain, you need philosophical categories, language to explain beliefs. See, when Jesus comes out of Judaism, Jesus as a Jew, there's plenty of categories in Hebrew thought to explain who Jesus was. Messiah, prophet greater than Isaiah, the Messiah, the son of David, and so on. There's all these categories. But out in the Gentile Roman world, those categories didn't exist. So if you're a Roman believer or just a Roman curious about what Christians believe, it's like, well, who is this man? Or was he a man? Well, fortunately, the phenomenal education of the three Cappadocians enabled them to wrestle with this question. And the pressing heresy of their day is called Arianism. This was promoted by a priest named Arius, and he said that God the Father had begotten, in other words, created or gave rise to Jesus at a certain point, which implies that Jesus did not always exist. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that Judaism is monotheistic and Christianity is no different, but Christianity talks about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. It sounds like three different gods. And Christianity has to bend over backwards in its early years to define how this is not three gods. This is three, say, ways people experience God, manifestations of God. Well, it's pretty complicated. So Christianity has to bend over backwards to argue that Jesus was co-eternal with the Father. By the way, for you docents that are listening, there are a number of paintings in the Timken collection where you can see the painter, the artist, or whoever commissioned the painting wanted the painting to reflect the relationship of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, because they're coming out of these kind of questions. Anyway, Basil and the others on his side, the anti-Arians, held that Jesus was co-eternal with God the Father and the Spirit of God. So they hold to what you may have heard about as Christian belief, the Trinity. And how do they reconcile this? Well, Basil promoted a very important philosophical concept that seemed to enable the belief to be coherent to people, and that was that the Father and the Son are consubstantial in English. The Greek term is homoousios. So consubstantial, we don't use that word for anything else that I can think of, but at least today. But if you hear, like in a Christian recitation of the beliefs, of Christians, the Nicene Creed, you will actually hear this word used today, consubstantial. So it is the formula of how to express the conviction, the belief that God, the Father and the Son are both eternal. So Basil is mired in this debate. And so to look at more the vignettes of the icon. So we're now in the lower row here, okay? So a very holy priest comes to visit him, Anastasius. I didn't tell his part of the story, but he's in this vignette here. But over here, we come to the Arian part on the right now, come to the Arian part of the story. So after Constantine died, the next few emperors, well, especially the second one after Constantine, is favorable to the Arians. And so were some of the other ones who came after him. And so the issue is not really solved at that point. There's some political favoritism to Arians. And so this church right here, the emperor gave to the Arians, the emperor of Valens, he gave this church to the Arians, and Basil then is furious. So there is a scene here representing when Basil and the Arians are debating about this church. And so an agreement is made. This sounds like something right out of the prophets in the Old Testament. They make this agreement and they say, all right, you Arians, you can pray. The church is locked. Okay, the church is locked up. Nobody can get in. You Arians, you pray for 3 nights and days to get them open. And if they are opened, it's yours. Basil and his people can then pray for 3 days. And if they get it open, then it goes to Basil's side, which is called the Orthodox. And you can imagine Basil's side wins. So Basil gets the church back, defeating the Arians in this vignette. Going to the lower region of the icon, in the very lower corner, you see a deacon here is pouring oil on a man's head for ordination or perhaps baptizing him. And you see in this vignette, Basil functioning as a bishop. Moving to the right, there's a widow here, and she comes to Basil with a scroll. And on the scroll, she has written all her sins, and she brings them to Basil to ask him to forgive her. Very soon after Basil dies, that is the next to the last vignette here, and the widow is there praying at his bier. Some people think, I don't see it myself, some people think that her scroll is laying on him in the bier, that he has held it with him. I'm not sure. I don't think it's clear enough. But one art historian would place the scroll on him in his bier. Then over here, the last vignette, we see he's buried. The burial or the closing of his casket in 379. This is probably Gregory of Nyssa closing his casket, because his attribute, very similar to Basil's in art, is the long, very long, dark beard. And also the phalonion or polystarion with many crosses of a bishop. Yeah, so we've been around the whole icon. We've gone from the left to the right, then remind you left to right, going down all the way. So what did Basil really look like? Well, the attribute of Basil is, like Nyssa, is the dark hair and the very pointed beard. This is probably the oldest existing icon of Basil. This is John Chrysostom on the right. We haven't even begun to refer to him. But this icon is with most of the oldest icons that exist and are in this monastery down in the lower left. I've told you about this before in other lectures. I have to keep repeating it because it's such a significant place. This is St. Catherine's in the Sinai Desert, and it's been there since the 300s, and its collection of icons is beyond belief. So that's where this icon is. And yeah, so we will stop here, and I would be happy to take some questions. If Ilse, if you want to take questions for me. I can't hear you, Ilse. You're muted. Okay.
I apologize. We have a question in the chat from Donna, and she asks, who are the figures in the round circles on side of the main icon's head?
Oh, yes, good. Okay, that would be Jesus and Mary. So Jesus on the left and Mary on the right. Very Byzantine portrayal of both of them. And you see Jesus, they both are what we call a halo here. That's called being nimbed, N-I-M-B-E-D. Like nimbus is the word for clouds, like a word for clouds, nimbed. Yes, other questions, please.
What is that? I don't know if you can hear me. What is that piece that's on our left that's brown and before his leg there?
Right here? This right here?
Above that
I was
piece
looking
above
at that, yeah. Part of it is undergarment vestment here hanging down, but I think it's really his legs here. The way his leg is portrayed.
The piece above that is what I was wondering, because it looks like there's
piece, this is an under vestment. Let's see, I didn't put all the terms for vestments in here, but this is an under vestment. So yeah, the vestments are relatively complicated. This one right here, this is called what's it called?
Chasuble?
Well, in Western Christianity, it's a chasuble, but there's another term. I'm forgetting it for right now. This vestment right here, the chasuble, is about 12 feet long. And so that's wound around him, long in the back, long in the front. But underneath, he has various other vestments, whose terms I don't have on the tip of my tongue right now. Yeah, that's a good question.
So what about the thing in his hand that looks like a scarf?
Yes, actually, he's holding the Gospels probably. And in honor of the Gospels, many times they're wrapped like in a holy cloth. So it could be representing that.
And the other hand is a blessing?
Yes, his hand is in a traditional symbolizing a blessing. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Someone else, please.
I would just like to say this has been excellent, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh,
I will
thank
be
you.
recommending it to some of my Franciscan friar friends who I think would benefit from your lecture as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I appreciate everybody who's chimed in here today. It looks like on my screen, it looks like there's about 48 people out there. I'm sorry I can't see you well. That's such a disadvantage of Zoom. When I'm trying to show you something on the screen, but I can't see all your faces, and I wish I could. Maybe the day will come when we can have more lectures in person.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gilman, for such a fascinating tour. And before everybody goes, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our social media channels, our Facebook or YouTube page. And if you'd like any further information on future tours being put on by the museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. And thank you again for joining us this morning. And thank you, Dr. Gilman, for a wonderful presentation. Goodbye, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.